November 21st, 1916, Verdun sector. The 137th Infantry Regiment huddles in frozen mud as German shells pound their forward positions every 4 minutes. Pierre Dulac writes his final letter home with fingers too numb to hold the pencil steady. What does it mean to live underground for months? How do you fight when your rifle freezes solid? When does survival become worse than death? The Western Front stretches 450 miles from the North Sea to Switzerland. French forces hold 290 miles of this line. Since August 1914, 3 million French soldiers have rotated through trenches that began as temporary earthworks and evolved into underground cities of mud, wire, and death. The 137th Regiment represents one small piece of this massive machine, 800 men tasked with holding 1,200 yards of front line against the German 6th Army. The day begins at 4:30 in the morning with stand to. Every man in the forward trench climbs the fire step and peers into no man's land through the pre-dawn darkness. Sergeant Marcel Bernard of the 3rd Company counts his men by voice in the blackness. Dulac, present. Moreau, present. Leblanc, no answer. Leblanc took shrapnel in the head during the night bombardment and died without making a sound. Dawn patrol means 2 men crawl through the wire to check for German movement. Lieutenant Henri Castagnac selects volunteers by pointing at random faces in the gray light. No one volunteers for dawn patrol. The wire extends 30 yards beyond the French parapet, twisted steel that catches uniforms, skin, and screams. Corporal Jean Roux and Private Auguste Martin slip over the top at 5:15 and belly crawl toward the German line. They return 45 minutes later with news of fresh digging and the smell of German coffee drifting across the wasteland. Breakfast arrives at 7 o'clock in metal containers carried by men from the reserve trench, coffee made from acorns and chicory. Bread baked 4 days ago and hard as stone, canned beef that tastes like metal shavings. The men eat standing in ankle-deep water because the drainage system collapsed during last week's bombardment. Private Dulac dunks his bread in the coffee until it softens enough to chew. His gums bleed constantly from scurvy, and his teeth feel loose in their sockets. The German bombardment begins at 8:30 sharp every morning. The pattern never changes. High explosive shells for 10 minutes to collapse trenches and dugouts. Shrapnel shells for 15 minutes to kill anyone caught in the open. Gas shells when the wind favors the German positions. The men of the 137th learn to read the incoming fire by sound. The low whistle means high explosive landing far behind the line. The sharp crack means shrapnel bursting overhead. The soft pop means gas, and every man reaches for his mask in the same desperate motion. Captain Louis Dumont commands the company from a dugout carved 12 feet underground. Electric lighting runs from a captured German generator. Maps cover every wall, marked with red pencil to show where the line has moved backward over the past 6 months. Dumont receives orders by telephone from battalion headquarters, located 2 miles behind the front in a reinforced farmhouse cellar. The orders rarely change. Hold the line. Report casualties. Request ammunition. If you value documented World War I history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Now back to the story. The rats arrive with the first warm weather in March. Norway rats the size of cats that feed on corpses, scattered across no man's land. The men hear them scratching inside the trench walls at night, gnawing through sandbags to reach the bodies buried in the parapets. Private Martin wakes up one morning with rat bites on his hands and face. The rats carry typhus, trench fever, and diseases that have no names. Battalion Medical Officer Dr. Paul Lemaire counts 47 cases of rat bite fever in the regiment during the month of March alone. Lice live in every seam of every uniform. The men call them arithmetic because they multiply constantly. Sergeant Bonnard organizes daily delousing sessions where the men remove their shirts and pick insects from the fabric with fingernails worn down to the quick. The lice lay eggs in the warm folds of cloth near the armpits and groin. Each female produces 300 eggs in her lifetime. The eggs hatch in body heat. The cycle begins again. Trenchfoot claims more casualties than German bullets in some sectors. The condition begins with numbness in the toes, spreads to swelling that splits boot leather, and ends with gangrene that turns flesh black and soft. Corporal Roux loses 3 toes to trench foot in April. The medical orderly cuts them off with a bayonet, sterilized in rum. No anesthetic. 4 men hold Roux down while he screams through a leather strap clenched between his teeth. Sleep comes in 20-minute intervals between bombardments. The men curl up in shallow scrapes carved into the trench wall, wrapped in ground sheets that provide no warmth and little protection from the rain that falls constantly from October through May. Private Dulac dreams about his wife Marie and their farm in Normandy. He wakes up calling her name into the darkness, then remembers where he is and falls silent. Mail arrives twice a week when the supply roads remain open. The men gather around Sergeant Bonnard as he reads names from soggy envelopes. Letters from home describe harvest seasons, village festivals, children learning to walk. The gap between these peaceful images and the reality of trench warfare creates a psychological wound that has no medical term. Some men stop opening their letters, others read the same letter 50 times until the paper disintegrates. German snipers work from positions hidden in the ruins of Fleury Village, 800 yards across no man's land. They use captured French rifles with telescopic sights and fire single shots at dawn and dusk when French soldiers expose themselves above the parapet. Lance Corporal Georges Petit keeps a tally of sniper kills in his sector. 17 French dead since February. The Germans move their positions every few days, firing from church tower ruins, collapsed houses, shell craters deep enough to hide a man. Patrols venture into no man's land after midnight when the moon disappears behind clouds. Lieutenant Castagnac leads these missions personally, selecting 6 men armed with grenades, wire cutters, and knives sharpened on trench stones. The objective never varies: capture a German prisoner for interrogation. The patrols crawl through mud thick as soup, following compass bearings toward enemy positions marked on hand-drawn maps. Most patrols return empty-handed. Some don't return at all. The German attack begins at 4:45 on June 7th. Artillery preparation lasts 3 hours and fires 12,000 shells into the French positions. The barrage lifts at 7:45, and German infantry advances in waves across no man's land. The 137th Infantry Regiment holds 900 yards of front line with 230 men fit for duty. Machine guns jam with mud and blood. Rifles misfire from fouled ammunition. Hand-to-hand fighting continues for 6 hours. Private Dulac dies at 2:15 in the afternoon with a German bayonet through his chest. He falls backward into the communication trench, clutching the letter from his wife Marie that arrived that morning with news of their first child. The letter soaks up blood and trench water until the words become unreadable. Sergeant Bonnard finds the letter in Dulac's pocket during the body count that evening and adds it to a pile of personal effects that will never reach their destinations. The attack fails. German casualties number 412 dead, including Major Hans Muller of the 2nd Battalion, 6th Bavarian Reserve Regiment. French casualties number 306 dead, including Lieutenant Castagnac, Corporal Roux, and Private Martin. The front line remains exactly where it was at dawn. The wire needs repair, the dead need burial, the living need replacement. Reinforcements arrive on June 9th. 150 men from depot battalions, most under 20 years old, none with frontline experience. They stare at the corpses, stacked like cordwood behind the support trench, and ask questions that have no answers. How long does it take to get used to the smell? When does the bombardment stop? Why don't we just go home? The new men learn fast, or die fast. Private Claude Bisset from Lyon survives his first patrol by following exactly 5 feet behind Sergeant Bonnard and never asking questions. Private Michel Troyes from Reims dies on his 2nd day when he raises his head above the parapet to look for German positions. A sniper's bullet enters his left eye and exits through the back of his skull, spraying brains across the fire step. Summer brings flies that blacken the corpses scattered across no man's land. The smell reaches French positions on hot afternoons when the wind shifts from the east. Gas masks provide some relief, but the men cannot wear them constantly without suffocating. They stuff cloth in their nostrils and breathe through their mouths, tasting death with every inhalation. Battalion headquarters issues a standing order: no unauthorized truces with German forces. The order exists because truces happen anyway. German and French soldiers meet in shell craters to trade cigarettes for chocolate, information for ammunition, respect for shared suffering. These meetings last minutes and save lives on both sides. Officers who discover unauthorized truces face court-martial and execution. The regiment rotates out of the line on August 15th after 9 months in continuous contact with the enemy. The survivors march 8 miles to reserve positions near Bar-le-Duc, where they sleep in barns and eat hot food cooked over wood fires. Of the original 800 men who entered the trenches in November 1915, 112 remain fit for duty. The rest are dead, wounded, missing, or transferred to other units as individual replacements. Private letters home describe clean clothes, hot meals, and beds with mattresses. They do not mention the nightmares that begin the moment the shelling stops. They do not describe the way every sudden noise triggers a dive for cover that leaves grown men trembling in doorways. They do not explain why laughter sounds wrong and silence feels dangerous. New orders arrive on September 3rd. The 137th Infantry Regiment will return to the front line on September 8th to relieve the 142nd Regiment in the Champagne sector. The war continues. The trenches wait. The cycle begins again with different faces wearing the same uniforms and the same mud. New orders arrive on September 3rd. The 137th Infantry Regiment will return to the front line on September 8th to relieve the 142nd Regiment in the Champagne sector. The war continues. The trenches wait. The cycle begins again with different faces, wearing the same uniforms and the same mud. The autumn rains begin in October and continue without pause through December. Water rises to waist level in some sections of the front line. Trench pumps work continuously, powered by men who take shifts at the handles because the electric pumps fail when water reaches the generators. Captain Dumont records pump duty rosters in his daily log: 4 hours on, 2 hours off, around the clock. The pumps move 100 gallons per minute when they work. The rain adds 300 gallons per minute when it falls hard. Frostbite replaces trench foot as the primary medical concern when temperatures drop below freezing in January 1917. Dr. Lemaire treats 67 cases in the first week of the new year alone. The men wrap their feet in newspaper, salvaged from supply packages, but newspaper disintegrates in wet boots within hours. Sergeant Bonnard orders daily foot inspections, where each man removes his boots and shows his toes to a corporal who checks for black spots that indicate dying tissue. German raids increase during the winter months when darkness lasts 14 hours. Small groups of German soldiers cross no man's land in the early morning hours, armed with grenades and clubs wrapped in barbed wire. The raids target French listening posts and communication trenches, seeking prisoners for intelligence and supplies for their own units. The French respond with similar raids, creating a night war fought by men who crawl through mud and kill silently with knives and entrenching tools. Corporal Bisset leads a raid on February 14th that captures 2 German prisoners and a cache of stick grenades. The raid begins at 2:30 in the morning, when cloud cover blocks the moon completely. Bisset selects 5 men from volunteers who have survived at least 3 months in the line. They blacken their faces with mud and remove all metal objects that might reflect light or make noise. The approach takes 2 hours of crawling through shell holes filled with ice water. The German position consists of a forward listening post manned by 4 soldiers from the 110th Infantry Regiment. The French attack begins with grenades thrown simultaneously into the German position, followed by close combat with bayonets and clubs. The fight lasts less than 3 minutes. 2 Germans die immediately, 2 surrender. The French withdraw with their prisoners and captured equipment before German artillery responds with a barrage that craters the empty position. Interrogation reveals German food shortages and declining morale in enemy units facing the French sector. The prisoners, 19-year-old Heinrich Weber from Munich and 22-year-old Franz Kellner from Stuttgart, describe rations reduced to black bread and turnip soup. Their unit has received no fresh meat in 6 weeks and no chocolate in 3 months. Both men volunteer information about German artillery positions and patrol schedules in exchange for hot food and medical treatment for infected wounds. Spring offensive plans arrive by courier on March 20th. The French High Command orders the 137th Infantry Regiment to participate in a general attack across the Champagne front, scheduled for April 16th. The objective: advance 2 miles and capture the village of Moronvilliers before German reserves can respond. Artillery preparation will begin on April 10th and continue for 6 days, firing 400,000 shells into German positions. Preparation begins immediately. Engineers dig assault trenches forward of the main line, extending French positions 100 yards closer to German wire. Supply units stockpile ammunition, food, medical supplies, and equipment for the advancing troops. Each man receives extra rations, 200 rounds of ammunition, 4 grenades, wire cutters, entrenching tools, and first aid packets. Officers study maps and rehearse the advance using scale models built behind the lines. The artillery preparation begins at dawn on April 10th, with a barrage that shakes the ground 15 miles behind the front line. French 75mm guns fire shrapnel shells at German trenches. 155mm howitzers destroyed German strongpoints with high explosive shells. Heavy mortars drop shells directly into German positions, collapsing dugouts and burying entire companies under tons of earth and timber. German counter-battery fire responds within hours, targeting French gun positions with equal intensity. The duel continues day and night, with both sides firing continuously except for brief pauses to service overheated barrels and replace worn equipment. French gunners work 4-hour shifts because longer exposure to the constant noise and concussion causes temporary deafness and disorientation that affects accuracy. Private Weber, the German prisoner, warns his French interrogators that German commanders expect the attack and have prepared defensive positions in depth. The first German trench line is held lightly by expendable troops. The main resistance will come from machine gun nests positioned in the second and third lines, supported by artillery pre-registered on likely French objectives. Weber draws detailed sketches of German positions from memory, marking machine gun locations and ammunition dumps. The attack begins at 6:15 on April 16th, with a final hour of intensive bombardment followed by the infantry assault. The men of the 137th Infantry Regiment climb out of their trenches and advance in waves across no man's land. Following compass bearings toward German positions, obscured by smoke and dust from the continuing artillery barrage, Captain Dumont leads the first wave, consisting of 60 men armed with rifles and bayonets. They advance at walking pace across ground churned into a moonscape by 6 days of bombardment. Shell craters overlap each other, creating a terrain where every step might plunge a man into a hole filled with water, wire, or corpses. The distance to the German line measures 800 yards on the map, but requires 40 minutes to cross on foot. German machine guns open fire when the French advance reaches the 400-yard mark. The guns fire from concealed positions that survived the bombardment, protected by reinforced concrete and steel plates. Maxim guns sweep the advancing French troops with overlapping fields of fire, cutting down entire squads in seconds. The distinctive rapid-fire chatter of German machine guns drowns out the shouted orders of French officers trying to maintain control of the attack. Sergeant Bonnard falls with machine gun bullets in his chest and legs at 11:30 in the morning, less than 50 yards from the German wire. He continues shouting orders to his men until blood fills his lungs and speech becomes impossible. Private Bisset reaches Bonnard's position and attempts to drag him back toward French lines, but German fire is too intense for movement in any direction. The second wave advances at noon, consisting of 40 men under the command of Lieutenant Paul Gerard, recently transferred from a depot battalion with no frontline experience. Gerard leads his men directly into the same machine gun fire that stopped the first wave, believing that momentum and courage will overcome German resistance. The second wave reaches the 100-yard mark before concentrated fire forces the survivors to seek cover in shell craters. Hand-to-hand fighting begins when small groups of French soldiers reach the German wire using routes concealed by smoke and terrain. The wire extends 20 yards deep and includes new obstacles: steel spikes driven into the ground, explosive charges triggered by tripwires, and pits filled with sharpened stakes. French wire cutters work frantically to clear paths, while German defenders throw grenades and fire rifles at point-blank range. Corporal Bisset cuts through the wire at 1:15 in the afternoon and enters the German trench system with 3 surviving members of his squad. The fighting continues with bayonets, clubs, and grenades in confined spaces underground. German defenders include men from the 110th Infantry Regiment and the 203rd Reserve Regiment, supported by machine gun crews and flamethrower teams equipped with portable fuel tanks. The flamethrowers appear at 2 o'clock. Operated by German soldiers wearing protective suits and breathing apparatus, the weapons project streams of burning oil 40 feet into French positions, turning trenches into furnaces that consume men, equipment, and oxygen. French soldiers, caught by flamethrower attack, die screaming, their clothing and hair ignited by oil that sticks to skin and burns until the fuel is exhausted. French casualties mount steadily throughout the afternoon. Companies that began the attack with 50 men report 10 or 12 survivors by 4 o'clock. Medical orderlies work continuously, carrying wounded soldiers back across no man's land under fire from German snipers who target stretcher bearers and medical personnel. Dr. Lemaire operates without anesthetic in a forward aid station established in a captured German bunker, amputating limbs and removing shrapnel by lamplight. The attack fails by 6 o'clock when surviving French troops withdraw to their starting positions. German counterattacks begin immediately, with fresh troops advancing across the same ground to reoccupy positions temporarily captured by French forces. The fighting continues until darkness falls, with both sides suffering additional casualties for terrain that changes hands repeatedly and ends the day exactly where it began. Final casualty reports reach battalion headquarters at midnight. The 137th Infantry Regiment suffers 423 casualties during the April 16th attack, 167 dead, 212 wounded, 44 missing. German casualties in the same sector number approximately 300. According to prisoner interrogations and captured documents, the village of Moronvilliers remains in German hands. Captain Dumont dies of wounds on April 18th in a field hospital 12 miles behind the front line. Shrapnel from a German artillery shell severed arteries in his left leg and abdomen. He remains conscious long enough to dictate a final report describing the attack and recommending decorations for soldiers who displayed exceptional courage under fire. The report lists Sergeant Bonnard for posthumous promotion and Corporal Bisset for the Croix de Guerre. Replacement troops arrive on April 22nd, 180 men from depot battalions in southern France, most with 6 weeks of basic training and no combat experience. They carry new rifles, clean uniforms, and letters from families who believe the war will end before summer. The survivors of the April attack train the replacements in trench warfare, teaching lessons learned through months of contact with German forces. The trenches settle back into routine. Stand to at dawn, breakfast in metal containers, daily bombardments at predictable hours, patrols after midnight, mail twice a week when supply roads remain open. The rats multiply in the warming weather. The lice spread through new uniforms within days of issue. The cycle continues with different faces wearing the same uniforms in the same mud. Lieutenant Colonel Henri Marchand assumes command of the regiment in May, replacing Colonel Dubois, who suffers a nervous breakdown after witnessing the April casualties. Marchand arrives from staff duty in Paris with theories about offensive warfare and plans for future attacks. He inspects the front line positions and declares them inadequate for modern combat, ordering improvements that require men to work instead of rest during their brief periods away from the firing line. The Americans arrive in June, members of the 1st Infantry Division assigned to quiet sectors for combat training alongside experienced French units. The American soldiers appear clean, well-fed, and enthusiastic about fighting Germans. They ask the same questions asked by French replacements 8 months earlier. How long does it take to get used to the smell? When does the bombardment stop? Why don't we just go home? French veterans teach American soldiers the fundamentals of trench warfare, without explaining why these lessons matter. How to recognize the sound of incoming artillery by the whistle of shells. How to identify German snipers by muzzle flash and report their positions to French artillery observers. How to cross no man's land at night without triggering German flares that illuminate the entire sector for machine gun fire. The American enthusiasm fades quickly. Private James Sullivan from Boston dies on his 3rd day in the trenches when he stands up in daylight to get a better view of German positions. Private Robert Chen from San Francisco develops trench foot in his 1st week and requires evacuation to a base hospital. The Americans adapt to trench warfare at the same rate as French soldiers. They learn fast or die fast. Summer brings the same flies, the same smell, the same routine of survival in conditions that reduce human beings to their most basic functions: eating, sleeping, killing, dying. The war continues with no visible end. German positions remain exactly where they were in 1914. French positions advance and retreat by hundreds of yards that cost thousands of lives. The front line moves like a living thing that breathes men in and exhales corpses. The 137th Infantry Regiment ceased to exist as an effective fighting unit on November 11th, 1918, not because of enemy action, but because there were no longer enough French citizens alive to fill its ranks. The regiment's war diary, Gangowitz, discovered in French military archives in 1973, recorded a final entry written in pencil by an unknown hand. We held the line.